Excellent. Okay. If we look at the names and faces, many of you, I think a majority of you are Asian in general background. Let me start with a couple of big classifications in Asia that Wenmin is talking about, for instance, in her master's thesis on Chinese nationalism. You heard a broader framework from Alan Zhang last week, and we've heard concepts like cultural policy. One of the big concepts in the current national plan is now cities, not just urban, rural, but urban and rural and cities are very much actively used and discussed cultural concepts in China today, illustrated especially by Wen Miao's focus on the website of discussions of what is nationalism, and we discussed how she has referred to the younger woman who's sort of illustrating through her cooking, her sewing, her knitting, traditional rural cultural activities in China. Okay, how does Parsons come into this? What I want to look at is placing Parsons in a broader historical context that many people in the 19th century, from Weber, Durkheim, the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft of Tönnies, Georg Simmels writing on the Metropolis, Louis Wirth in the 30s, they were all dealing with the idea of rural urban, as the Chinese are discussing today, as the interpenetration, the shifting of these huge classifications and visible cultural distinctive types. One could argue, for instance, almost that rural Chinese are analogous to Mexicans or African Americans in the US. They're seen with some difference, let's say. I won't go beyond that. What did Parsons do in this example? He moved beyond the two. So how did Max Weber treat this? Basically as rural and urban. And he has a book on the city and the medieval city as a place where you could escape the feudalism, where your father, your son, your grandson would always be under the same master. And so you could somehow run away to a city, and the city was the place of freedom. So that was the classic European sort of freedom versus, and the residents of cities were called burghers or bourgeois, and the bourgeoisie emerged as a classic concept in Marx out of the idea of the city in that sense as fostering a different cultural perspective. Okay. Max Weber conceptualized these more as ideal types: rural, urban, city, feudal, and the like. And he came, of course, from the background of Hegel with a German idealistic tradition at the same time that they were battling with Marx in a materialist tradition. How could one pull these things together? That is, at the end of the 19th century, people were battling, mercilessly over these, much more than we see today. And Marx, Hegel, idealism, ideal types, rural, urban, were the major categories being debated and discussed. Let me just show you briefly, if I can do this right. We'll go over to Parsons introduced into this what he called the pattern variables. Instead of saying there are two types, rural and urban, he said, let's look at 5 pattern variables. And here they are. Affectivity versus affective neutrality, sort of emotional or not, as extremes. Self-orientation, me too, versus collectivity, the nation, the bigger entity. Third, universalism, generalizing to the universal versus particularism, a particular case of a case, especially a case study is exactly that. Ascription, which you have an ascribed position because you were black or white, and you can't change that, versus achievement, which you can achieve by working hard, at least these extremes. Finally, specificity versus diffuseness. So your relationship can be a contract, which is very specific. You do this, and in return, you get that, versus a diffuse kind of relationship among persons. Okay, this is a little fancier than just rural-urban, but it illustrates Parsons's way of thinking, of taking concepts that people have used for hundreds of years and not accepting them in their, quote, historic, authentic terms, instead reconceptualizing them by looking more deeply at what they really were talking about. Not just really, but what were the subcomponents that are operating? Because these go back to rural, these are present today and in the past in rural China. These are present in feudal Europe and the city. But what this does is to say, let's look more closely and think of ways of generalizing more abstractly, but then going back to the specific case. I start with that, even though we don't have a reading on this, just to illustrate Parsons in the 20s and 30s, when he was like Max Weber, he was a student of economics, more economic history as well. His father was a university president in Colorado, in a religious city, Colorado Springs. He went to Amherst College, studied economics, then went to Germany and discovered Max Weber, and then sort of followed around and worked with people who'd worked with Weber. Then came back and spent his whole career teaching at Harvard. Initially in discussions with people, that is, initially he applied, I think, to the economics department, and the economics department said, you know, he's a brilliant guy, but he doesn't quite fit. Why don't you talk to him in sociology? And they said, well, we don't know what sociology is, but let's all talk together. So in the 30s, this was happening, and the lead person was Pitirim Sorokin, the Russian author of a grand multi-volume work on social and cultural dynamics. And then young people like Robert Merton, George Homans, and other people who argued and met together. L.J. Henderson was a guy who worked on equilibrium and concepts from how to generalize some of the biological concepts. So they had faculty workshops and stuff like this. And Parsons then was looking for a way to pull these pieces together. And he did the same thing in his more general work, 1937, The Structure of Social Action. And I will ask you, as our focal reading today is basically a very 15 page summary of the 700 pages of The Structure of Social Action. Can anybody follow Blaylock and Stinchcomb and give us a one-figure summary of what Parsons said in his 700 pages as he tried to boil it down? I've played with this myself in trying to summarize this. Anybody want to try? What are the big ideas, and how can you put them together and connect them to everything I've just said? How does this connect with China today, with the categories? How does it connect with the European tradition going back to the Greeks? And how is it different? What does he have to say that's new? Building on, but very close to Durkheim and Weber, who we talked about last time. Okay. Here's my one figure answer. Scroll just a little bit more. Can you see? Let me get, I think it needs, yeah, there we go. Okay. Actor, ends, means, conditions, and norms. So he's talking about people who are the actors in a social system. What their ends are, what do they want? Money, status, power, creativity, art. What are the means that they can use to get those things? And if we start with this first line of utilitarianism, you have a consumer or a producer, and they have money, and they can then exchange those, but they're not clear norms or ends defining what they want. The ends are people maximize their utility. Their preferences are undefined in classical economic theory. Just as many psychologists would say, people want to achieve their goals, but they don't really define the goals following this tradition of utilitarian philosophy. This is a British label for widely used in the sort of 18th, 19th century British tradition. Jeremy Bentham is a classic illustration leading to economics, modern microeconomics, markets. So what this suggests is the first line of people following this utilitarian tradition, including most psychologists and economists in the 20th century and 21st century, leave out ends and norms. Okay. Psychologists are nearby, building on a sort of Darwinian conception of psychology and human behavior. The Chicago 1920s sociologist talked about human ecology. The Burgess zones came from Darwin. Skinner, who knows? Everybody know, who knows who Skinner was? Skinner was the most important psychologist in the US in probably 1960. And he said, we don't want to study chimpanzees. That's what the Germans do. We want to study rats. We'll just put them in a cage and we'll see if we put a little bit of water out there, what do the rats do? So he had no framework of anything like culture. But what he gave the rats was reinforcement. So if the rat, so he would train them to do different things based on having to press the bar 3 times. If they pressed the bar 3 times, they got some water. If they pressed it twice, they did not. But the conception of the Darwin Skinner is randomness trials. You try out anything. You don't have any cognitive conception of how the world works. You just try all kinds of stuff randomly. And some things may work, and maybe the smart rat, the smart person will put these together. So in terms of this line, we have actors. There are no ends. There are no norms. There are conditions, which you're in a cage, you're on an island, and there are no means which are explicitly linked to how you get to the end. So unlike utilitarianism, where you have a very smart person who tries to get the most out of the money you have, your limited budget, leads you to spend your money very frugally and carefully and rationally. With Darwin and Skinner, not at all. You don't have means. You don't think about a limited amount of money. You do anything. Okay, this contrasts again with another conception which we read about briefly, which is the bad book by Durkheim, I'll call it that, called The Rules of Sociological Method, where he overstates, and this is what Parsons really goes after and says, sociologism is silly. It's basically saying society around you is so imposed upon you that you have no choice. And so up here, even if you want to do certain kinds of things, you have no ability to achieve your goals. You don't have any means because you're just imposed by society on what you can do. Think of the CCCP, think of Hitler in a strong, overstated sort of form. And so what Parsons is doing here is going through each of these perspectives, which are the underlying kinds of assumptions which are found implicitly, often more than explicitly, in the theories themselves. The other extreme from these first three, which are sort of reducing people to rats or random behavior, or the outside world is imposed upon you, like the French state or the Chinese state, is the idealism best identified with Hegel, but it's a stronger tradition which went up through the 19th century. How does this relate to China today and to nationalism? It focuses on culture and cultural policy. It focuses on the ideals. And so what Wen Mio is reading about will lead people as well to say, and a version of this was called historicism, or a cultural, strong relativism in culturalistic terms, which says you can't compare China to any other country. Korea is just a non-country. That comes from the German Romantic idealistic tradition of stressing culture as here we are, look up here, the ends, that is the ideals of the society. See, this is 0-0 for utilitarianism and Skinner. It becomes the strong hand of the state with Durkheim. With Hegel and with this idealistic tradition, this is the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, which in Marx's hands became feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. Okay, so those kinds of historic stages, but as Marx said, as you all know, he stood Hegel on his head. So in that sense, Marx felt the same thing as Parsons did in doing something like this. But Parsons, in contrast to Marx, is not saying he's just standing Hegel on his head. He's saying there are lots of people who need improvement, not just Hegel. And I will build on 4 of these as he's doing here: utilitarian, etc. And then what is number 5? The voluntaristic theory of action. This is basically Parsons's distillation of the best of Darwin, Skinner, Freud, Durkheim, Hegel, and Marx, specifically through Durkheim and Weber. So he doesn't just talk about these as individuals or names. He pulls out the core ideas and he says, if we're going to have a voluntaristic theory of action where the individual has some choice, that's what the utilitarians and Skinner, Darwin, they say, of course, you can run around in the Skinner box, you can do anything you want. So the utilitarian psychologist or economic actor, you can produce and consume anything you want, but they don't say where and why and how. And so his point is, in order to be not just voluntaristic, and if you attribute to an individual that they can have choice, the question is over what? That is, if you're just saying they're acting randomly, that doesn't really meet the criterion that Parsons is imposing of voluntarism. You have to be conscious of some ends. You have to be conscious of all 5 of these things, that you are acting in a situation where you want to get something, but you've only got a fixed budget. You know that the state is there, but the state is not all controlling. And there are norms that your family and your friends and other people say you should follow. Okay, so the rest of the book is filling in the details of this kind of 5 plus and minus signs. So what I'm suggesting you try to do when you read more generally is look for the key ideas. This is also not even in the text. This is distilled from the appendix of the book of Parsons. And these are, he doesn't use any of these simple terms that I do, but instead, as I say here, this is my figure in labels. Parsons uses more abstract terms. For instance, Darwin and Skinner is called rational, anti-intellectual, individualistic positivism. So it's not that easy to keep that right in the front of your head when you get to the next page and say, what's the next perspective? So I'm trying to make it clearer and more straightforward, as Parsons himself did decade after decade. So by the end of his life, he was writing, and I'm sure with the help of a number of editors, things like those little Prentice Hall books, and then these selections and theories of society, which have gotten more clear, but nevertheless, some of it is not quite as clear as some of it might be. Okay, let me maybe pause for a moment as I've gotten out a first bunch of ideas. How do any of these strike you as things you either want to talk about or ask questions of, or anything else? Let me let's turn off. I've got a background noise. I'm trying to turn this down. Okay. Comments, questions from anyone?
Not really much of a comment, and I don't think I was able to process this piece very well apart from taking it in as a very historically broad literature review. And I was wondering if you could share some more contemporary applications of what Parsons is actually accomplishing here, rather than what he's relating in the early parts.
Yeah, I tried to do that with my leading off with my China nationalism examples on a blog right now that one of you is doing an MA on. But go ahead, Theo. More, any more you want? I mean, we can discuss more for sure. But that is, maybe what I did was too narrow, but for sure. But I mean, I don't want to say let's not. I mean, for sure, I'm trying to do that. But I guess I would say help me, and any of you else who may have had either the same reaction. That is, we don't want to say we want to ignore history and the past of ideas. That's the reason you're here, to try to see how we can build on some. But at the same time, we don't want to be prisoners of the past. We want to innovate ourselves. And that's one of the main points of this course, that you can use cultural creatively yourselves, make new boxes, extend it, build new and better theories than we've had in the past. So how can we combine the three with any other answers to the challenge which we've just heard put to us? How can we use any of this? So that is, how many of you were simply confused and it seemed like either garbage or impossible? How many thought it was just dry and too old? Or how many thought it was wonderful and it's the answer to all the questions I've been asking all my life? Anybody feel the lashed? Yes, okay.
Actually, yeah. When I read a discussion about this kind of philosophical discussion and the state, family, like smaller categories of analysis, actually I got these ideas not from like this older kind of analysis, but I got these ideas from other readings. Maybe it's kind of like other scholars have already internalized this idea. So I got like my thesis, I read Nancy Fraser. So Nancy Fraser says Marx, there's a hidden Adobe behind it, behind the production process, which is a reproduction. Like for the reproduction process to build a human being and laborers, there are state, families, schools, and whatever. There are a lot of factors like influencing how a human being should be like. So somehow I feel there's a parallel, but it's just really interesting. Like people do say similar things with different kind of vocabularies. Yeah, like when reading this.
Okay, and that's one good, clear answer to the challenge that we were posed. Anybody else want to comment or ask a question? Lena, is your hand up, or are you just tearing your hair out?
Well, I guess my hand wasn't really up. Yeah. Anyway, I guess so. Like with I guess I also saw it more as like a kind of historical, like, kind of summary. But in relation to the other readings we had for today, especially with the, let me check, the American Cultural Matrix, I can see how kind of those like old ideas are kind of like everywhere in like those newer kind of theories. So I can see how that there's like a relation, but also I would say I'm still like, there's still a lot of confusion in my mind too. So.
Is there any sort of single specific source of confusion or a sentence, a concept we could talk about? Just to be frank, I'm sure you're not alone.
No, I can't really kind of pinpoint it down, I guess, right now.
Okay. Your own German background is what we're largely talking about. That is, Parsons really learned this style as a graduate student in Germany, and then translating, especially several of the books of Max Weber, as did Schills. Who else? Other reactions to maybe first of all to this essay, but then answering these or responding to comments we've already heard.
I actually have a question regarding the nationalism topic that you just mentioned. You mentioned the cultural like strong relativism, because in terms of comparison, the Chinese nationalists, they denounce those Korean, especially Korean stealing behavior in terms of kimchi and other like traditions or traditional clothes, something like that. But in order to fit the fourth ism, that is the idealism, there are 5 factors here. But would you mind like clarify a bit on the fourth fact element, that is conditions? Why conditions here is lost in terms of the nationalism example?
Yeah, conditions or a word here for exterior things that you cannot control, such as the geography, the weather, the climate, or let's say the national state, if you're just an average citizen. In contrast to means. So means are things that are resources like money, which you can control if it's your money. So the GNP you cannot control as an individual, and that's sort of an exterior condition for you as an individual. And that's an abstract, simple, direct, abstract answer. Is that too abstract, or or you want more elaboration somehow?
So like conditions are something that we can't control, while means are social resources that we can get access to. Is that?
Yes, we can access, and we can maybe not directly spend them like just and completely by ourselves. In some theories, yes, but in others, they may involve other people a little bit. In the ideal case, it's things like money we can spend ourselves. And in this kind of discussion, if you want to flash forward and bring in, by contrast, say Gabriel Almond or Verba, and with their much more concrete examples of nationalism and types of nationalism, for instance, I mean, that they too directly link to your ideas, but in giving you foundations of what's included in Chinese nationalism more concretely than Parsons does here. But they build on, as they say very much, they're building on Schills and Parsons and their whole typology. But is that enough of an answer? Do you have something more general that was touched off by anything in this essay about Chinese nationalism, or anything else you wanted to raise?
So yes, I think I'm still a bit confused about, like, can we see that Chinese nationalism is a bit like overlapped with such idealism?
I'd say that let's call on Alan for a minute. Alan gave a terrific lecture in a class with me before, where he's really talking to Chinese students. And he framed it as he framed it, and I'll ask him if he can briefly explain that the big contributions of Europe came from the Italian Renaissance to European romantic nationalism. And that was it. You want to elaborate with romantic nationalism among the Germans and how that relates to China today?
Well, I remember I talked about cultural nationalism as the pioneer of this German romantic nationalism. The key figure is Herder. He is actually trying to preserve indigenous culture. So at the very beginning, nationalism or cultural nationalism was used as a means to defend against, dominant cultural hegemony. For example, French court culture, fashion, Louis XIV. So a lot of people argue that nationalism initially, particularly in the case of cultural nationalism, exemplified by Herder, is to defend local culture. But then we see that nationalism is the biggest killer of indigenous culture, because a lot of fine culture was basically homogenized by this nationalistic fervor. But in China, I think nationalism was a reaction against, largely a reaction against imperialism. In late 19th century, the almost crazy rebellion by the Boxer. They basically believe they are invincible, and the Empress Dowager made a mistake by trying to use these people to fend against the imperialists, thus provoking retaliation and invasion of 8 imperialist countries. Basically, it was an example of nationalism is a reaction against empire, and and at the same time, nationalism can bury empires, but it's an outgrowth of empires. So so I think in Chinese case, it's basically a reaction, and it's an outgrowth of anti-imperialism, and nationalism really took off during the anti-Japanese campaigns, and a lot of peasants were mobilized at the same time. So it's a very modern concept. So I think, of course, nationalism doesn't have to have any conditions. If you compare across history, some nationalism needs some sort of, uses some sort of resources, language, culture, but a lot of other nationalism don't actually need any basis or conditions. They can come out of thin air within 2 or 3 decades. You don't really need to go back and do any archaeological findings to prove that you used to be a tribe and you have any unique cultural markers or language. But what interests me the most is whether there is any difference between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And from what I understand, is a lot of countries in Western Europe which claim themselves to have this civic nationalism or healthy dose of nationalism actually had ethnic nationalism back in the religious war. They killed a lot of heretics, and during the Reformation that was bloody, and the 30 Years War in Germany made people sick and tired of fighting anymore, and they then developed this idea of national sovereignty embodied in the Westphalian system. So what I'm skeptical about is how people, without any qualification, saying that we represent healthy democratic nationalism or civic nationalism, while Eastern Europe represents ethnic nationalism. They're more bloody, So I think it's all historically contingent, but ultimately, I don't think that nationalism needs any solid foundation. It's basically telling stories. Talking about Finland, I mean, there used to be no Finnish culture, but once they identify that Finnish language is so unique by tracing back to the Indo-European language system, and finding that Finnish Ugric language is out of this Indo-European system, they think that they are unique and they are special. But basically, it was just so ad hoc, and we can find a lot of examples about this in the current world as well. So yeah, it's quite interesting. And nationalism has so many forms. I mean, every country can have its own nationalism. And in China today, nationalism is basically a legitimizing tool for the political system, and it can transform and it can shift to a different form if it's politically convenient. So, and also in Hungary, which I studied a little bit, it's quite interesting because a lot of Hungarians, they would compare life before 1989 and the life in recent decades. And some of them argue that they live more happily in the Soviet system than in today's Germany-led European Union. So I think a lot of it is recently reinforced by the political campaign or political propaganda by Viktor Orban. I think largely because of this fear of emigration of young people to other more prosperous Western European countries. And there is demography plays a big role. And this demographic existential fear led to this nationalistic story. It's a reaction against this European Union technocratic system, but it's just it's just a way to, how to say, just the defensive mechanism, or just displacing some sort of fear by hyping up another fear. Yeah, so I think this condition, what I can get from the idea of condition is nationalism doesn't need any prerequisites. And if you go back in history, there's no clear-cut difference between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. I mean, it's just a matter of how you become this sort of healthy nationalism. There is a historical trajectory in the making of nationalism in the history of today. So what I can think of, it was really bloody over after the Reformation, and that was the point when the cost of building civic nationalism was actually incurred.
Okay, that's helpful. Just to mention one or two fairly simple descriptive points. In the period you're talking about with Herder, there was no Germany. There was a German culture, and culture created the ideal of having a German nation. There were instead Bavaria, Prussia, the different regions and regional governments, but they did not become unified until the middle and the end of the 19th century, especially 1870 with Bismarck. France, by contrast, had become a national state much earlier, centralized through especially Versailles, the grandeur of fireworks and parties and the elegant lifestyle of Louis XIV, which attracted Catherine the Great, the German princes and dukes and so forth to come and try to build a court-like surrounding to define the nation or the national leadership. But Herder's idea, in a sense of localism or the Hungarians of trying to keep people there, is not just an abstract definition. There were people fighting, such as the Boxer Rebellion, for one end or one goal or another. Just as Stalin commissioned films to be made before and during World War II, and the one during World War II was called Ivan the Formidable. We say in English generally Ivan the Terrible, but he was the first Tsar, and his mark was made by driving out the residue of the Asian conquest of Russia. So the Russian, all these dukes and principalities across all of Russia were occupied and taxes were extracted. They were dominated by the followers of Genghis Khan. And they were there for over 200, almost 300 years. And so they were there in part because there was no Russian nation that was a strong, coherent nation with an army or anything like that. There were just individual princes. So both Germany and Russia did not exist as nations in the period that we're talking about. And in that sense, culture became an important mechanism in the ways that it's being, as Alan is talking about, it's being used in, or one use of it is to try to strengthen the central state or to prevent people from going away, especially foreign students like you. You mean they need you in your home country. And so nationalism is an important thing to say. I love my country and I will return. Okay, so elementary comments, but maybe not too much so. I guess just one last point is, let's also try to keep in mind in most of our paragraphs or every 5 or 10 minutes, let's try to see where specifically is there something that is cultural. That is, we don't want to just do general history of everything. We're trying to say, where is the specific cultural component and how does it connect? So I use deliberately Stalin paying top artists to make 2 films during World War II to heighten the nationalism of the Russian troops to fight, because St. Petersburg was occupied by the German troops for over a year. It was occupied when the film was made. So Stalin was saying, we've got to get those Germans out of here. And they finally did, but not until a year had gone by. And it was the Eastern Front, so-called, was the hardest part of the war for the Germans. Western Front was nothing. Okay. Other comments on Parsons? Yes.
So does this mean many mainstream culture today manufactured by the state apparatus for certain policy goals, for sure?
Yes, sir. You're speaking a little too fast for me to understand. Okay. Try again, just a little more slowly, please.
Yeah, so I'm just very curious, like whether this mean like our mainstream culture or popular, not like a Korean pop or something, but kind of like a nationalism mainstream culture. A lot of them manufactured by the state apparatus to achieve certain policy goals, like which is, yeah, I mean, the state apparatus and the family neighborhoods, like friends we see, which is more important, like in this aspect, like to produce a culture, or equally important, or depends?
Yeah, well, I guess the general answer from Max Weber is it depends, and there is no right general answer analogous to what Marx may have implied, or Darwin may have implied, that it's the biological evolution or it's the economic substructure. But the main point of Weber is don't waste your time looking for an answer to that kind of question. The answer is always some of each. and that's just as true of China today as it is of the US today, or Germany today, or Germany or the US or China 200 or 1,000 years ago. I mean, I'm overstating perhaps, but all of these, but put differently, they are not, however, independent. That is, and that's the point of Parsons, that we want to look at where and how and why these pieces connect to one another. And when we get to Goetz, we see some close examples of things like the royal progress, the king going around, or the court of Louis XIV was a mechanism stressed by Eisenstadt in his book on how you build an empire, that you build an empire. One way that Louis XIV did was by bringing to your court these kings and queens and dukes from across France, so they leave their local area. Then you can send in administrators to collect taxes, and they can become legitimate because your duke or your administrator, your owner of the Lille or Marseille is just having fun in Versailles. So people then begin to pay attention to the state apparatus rather than to the aristocrat who may have been the important, quote, owner of an area. So in that sense, nationalism can be used to an end, such as to strengthen the state, and that's a major example that we've used throughout these discussions. But at the same time, it can it can be bigger or imply the potential destruction of the state. So Wagner's great 4-volume work on is in a sense the foundational type of German Romantic nationalism ends with the destruction of all the kings. The castle goes up in flames and the gods are all killed. And in the same way that Max Weber would talk about the iron oppression of capitalism can destroy the voluntarism which is there. So in that sense, these are not necessarily optimistic, or put differently, the Disney versions of many of the European folk tales tend to Americans like happy endings. And maybe the contemporary world is closer to Americans. But if you read the 19th century Grimm brothers, who assembled all these European, especially German folk tales, they had some bloody, nasty folk tales that you brought up children to learn about and learn from, of what is life. So it's not as if it needs to be consensual, but I guess my point is, if we want to talk for a minute here, say, about the other things beyond the essay. That is, if you've looked at a little bit of some of the other, I mean, how many of you read more than the one essay? So nobody's read more than the one essay? One, okay. So we want to be cautious about expecting too much. But so then let me just say, for instance, the 4 letters A, G, I, and L are 4 kinds of processes that Parsons wrote about. Goal attainment is what is in that set of types I talked to you about, that you try to set a goal, and that's usually the national government or the state. You could then have adaptation, using the economy, using the best means to get to that end. So G, A, and then I is the integration of the pieces. So you have the different parts working together so that they can achieve that kind of goal, but then they can not fall apart or fight each other into pieces. And then L is called latent pattern maintenance and tension management. So his general idea is that this kind of 4 types and 4 processes are generalizable, and they're found in one person's head. They're found in your family dynamics, when your mother makes dinner and says, you're all loved together, and the father says, you're not loved, get out there and work harder. So he's being more goal-oriented. She's doing pattern maintenance and integration in ways that the same family, even the same people, may change their roles in doing these kinds of 4 things. And if that goes from the individual's mind and heart to the family and their roles, on up to a village, to a city, to a region, to a country, and the world. And so you can see these kinds of processes. So he looks for ways that these in turn tend to reinforce and complement each other, but repeat in a broadly analogous manner. And the origin of this was the work by Robert Bales, who was a social psychologist, where he, with his students, would sit behind a one-way mirror, or it looked like just a glass, and they would code in 50, 60 categories everything that everybody said. But their categories looked like what Parsons later used in these 4 kinds of processes. So one person would say, let's go, let's do something, we're just wasting our time here. Someone else would say, calm, John. You know, John, you get upset too easily. So another person will then say, oh, let's, so you can have people conversing in that way, performing different dynamics to keep the system working. That's the idea.
So, Professor, I have a question on the criticism of this so-called functionalist approach to social science. it seems to me that this AGIL or the other way around can explain a lot of things. I actually took the course of Edward Lauman maybe 6 or 7 years ago. His course was the first I took as a master student. So I tried to synthesize and internalize all this 2x2 table of Parsons. And a lot of them can explain enormously well. I mean, I can even share some of the 2x2 table with you guys. There are a lot of examples, like dating is the action, then G goal attainment. I mean, there are quite a lot of, can I share this table with
Sure.
you guys?
Go ahead if
Yeah, because it can illustrate pretty well what we're talking about. So I need to be a co-host. Okay, sure. All right. Yeah. Yeah, this is one example of the Parsonian AGIL system. Let's say dating is the action, and that's from the input side of the table. When goal is to get married. I mean, a lot of people may say, well, not necessarily to get married. So, but you can use a different way. You can interpret differently. And then integration is priority of being faithful and having children and continuing your lineage. So basically, this is a social regulation in order to maintain this system. I mean, each part is playing its role. And finally, the latent pattern maintenance, the cultural system is traced to the Judeo-Christian norm of marriage to have a family. So I just want to know how this tightly connected system, this pretty powerful tool, gradually lose the hearts and mind of sociologists. Is it just too cultural deterministic, or is it just too simple and too, how to say, formulaic, that it loses some emergent qualities in social life, or the complexity in social interaction?
so your question is, why has it lost over the years since Parsons, the popular sociologist?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. Okay.
Parsons' paradigm was basically modeled by most of sociologists in 60s, but in 70s it lost its fame among
Yes.
sociologists.
No, very much so. Now that's the big question, which to which I guess to simplify, there are two answers. One is that it was something like the inadequacies of the ideas. And the second is that it was the social and political context which led people to throw out parts or much of Parsons as well as other things. But irrespective of the specific ideas of Parsons, and having participated and seen a lot of, well, Parsons right after the 68, 69, came to Chicago and visited twice. And I taught a faculty seminar with him. And we had the sociology and other departments that were interested for a while, focusing on universities, because he was then writing a book on university organization. And it was a brilliant book. And I was working on universities at the same time with Peter Blau, who was here from Columbia. And we did an empirical study of universities as organizations. He and Jerry Platt did a survey of professors as individuals, and we put the two together, and we had many discussions with other people about these kinds of concerns. So there's a joint empirical foundation, which led to a, fat book on the American University by Parsons. And I would say he had a very, take a glance at it, he had a very sharp, solid eye for many things which people didn't articulate for 5, 10 years after those events. For instance, he stressed the degree to which the American university system had become so competitive and so meritocratic, the way the Asians are now in many respects, the examinations, the ranking of people, 1, 2, 3, 4, based on your position nationally in all of China, that had become more strong. And the scores, if you adjust them back to that period, have never been that high since. That is, people were working harder about 65, 67, 68, and we've now have basically lower standards. But Parsons stressed that the degree to which this was pushed, that is, no longer did we have simply Anglo-Saxon domination, ethnic or friendship or particularism. That is, there was a sense of meritocracy. And if you failed, you were at fault. And that sense of failure was so extreme that it led to the explosion against the whole American university system, and against the war in Vietnam, and against the United States national government, all together, including Talcott Parsons. So Parsons himself put his finger on that and basically said, we have too much rationality, or we've got too much G and A, and we don't have enough I and L. But at the same time, for instance, at the meetings of the I went to meetings, the American Sociological Association, when Parsons was speaking to the plenary, in a plenary session of maybe 1,000 people, and people would come with signs in advance holding up 4-letter words. And, when he would say something they disliked, you'd have, 150 4-letter words go up in the middle of Parsons's speech. So there was organized dissent, but it wasn't based specifically. That is, my take is 90% had nothing to do with the ideas. It was the war in Vietnam. It was the whole counterculture that was flexing its muscles, and we're living in with it today. It is the diversity we're living with today, most visibly, if you want to label it, or the me generation, the millennium, etc. These changes have grown very much out of the countercultural specifics in ways that I've had. Let's say in the last 10 years, students like Dan Silver, he was invited by Don Levine to give a course on the history of theory with Don, and he said, "Why don't you teach a section on Parsons?" And Dan he'd not read Parsons, so he pushed himself into it. He read Parsons and said, "Hey, this is fantastic stuff. Why didn't I read this before?" So there are people of roughly your generation who are saying, "There's a lot here." And you are now far enough from 68, whether it's Tiananmen Square in China or Paris and Columbia here, that you can read this and make your own judgment as to where and how you will find any of this useful or not, and choose to blend it with your own workings on Chinese nationalism, or retiring at age 35, or something else. So when John, I'll be frank and say, when John Levy Martin and I taught this course together, this was one of the things that we discussed because he was a student after 68 at Berkeley, which was the one of the two epicenters in the US. Berkeley and Columbia were the leading sort of radical student protest locations. And so he just grew up surrounded by this, and Parsons was obviously wrong. Nobody should read Parsons. And I was not a student of Parsons. I mean, I was a student of Merton, and Merton was building on, but distant as well. And yet, as a graduate student, I myself, I heard someone say, if you really want to do something well, find an ideal person you really admire and read everything they ever wrote. So even though I was a student at Columbia, I read Parsons, beginning to end. And I talked to people about that 10 years later, and they they can't believe it. But he had a lot of subtle things to say. And that is, in terms of simplification, for instance, the one thing that I'm trying to do in my courses now is to bring in the discussions of diversity, for instance, today, and the goals, the top current topics, Chinese nationalism or health, food, diets, I mean, all kinds of things which are hot issues today, and then say, what do different people have to say about these? And so I would say Parsons as well here is important, not just in what he wrote and said himself, but as a linkage to the legacy from Weber and Durkheim and the best of the European thinkers, even if European civilization is no longer as visibly much a leader as it was in 1914. Other questions or thoughts or reactions? How about any of your, I mean, we had a good discussion with Wen Mio. How about can we take maybe one or two others of your paper topics and think of how these relate to them? Did any of you ask yourself that question and either say, I see nothing, or say, here can I link this or that idea? How about feminism and gender roles linked with AGI&L? What's the relationship between feminism and AGI&L? 2 or 3 of you are really working seriously on feminism. Do these say that gender roles are biological? Do they say that they're in people's hormones? Do they say that they're in being married or not? Do they say that they're being older or younger or one generation or another? Now, the simple point I'm trying to make is that he's providing a sort of a systems culturally defined way of thinking of gender roles, whether it's within a family or more generally. And that one individual woman or women in the US compared to women in rural China may be higher or lower if we wanted to measure them, say in Bales's social psych lab. We could score who talks how in a family, who talks how in a classroom or any kind of conversation, or who does what in a self-administered questionnaire. We have the beginning of a smile in Yiling Lin's face. Is it about that or something else?
Yeah, I think of my project in the structure of AGI&L, but not the feminisms. Is this okay?
Sure. Now go ahead.
Okay. So I'm curious about. Yeah. Okay, great. So I am curious about the novelty and the new idea stuff how new ideas, where does new ideas come from, and how people accept new ideas. And so specifically, when I look into the pattern or the phenomena that researchers are doing the research, there is actually the AGIL for each researchers. So the A is adaptation, is like people are doing research, and the G is their goal is to make a breakthroughs or make very important contribution to their field. And I is integration. And I think the integration nowadays is cross-field cooperation, because the problem is getting harder and we need knowledge from different domain and to make really important breakthroughs. And the finally is L is I think is more general pattern is like, although among the system, the novelty is the new ideas is encouraged, but we also found out that new ideas is slowly to get accepted, and the slowly is represented in the it's really hard for a lot of people to get together and make a really important breakthroughs. It's not very easy to combine different knowledge from different people. So these things like this. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great. Now, there are a couple of papers where people have tried to compare national political systems with science. And you're, in a sense, doing that. You're looking at the more abstract aspects, but you're looking at how can we deal with something like power. And so one set of people, the so-called British, and then some continentals, Bruno Latour, developed a perspective called science studies, where they basically said, and it was based on case studies of individual laboratories, and they basically argued that the director of the lab imposes his will. And if you want to change, don't challenge the lab director, or you'll lose your job and you won't be promoted. I mean, that was basically their interpretation of science. Whereas Merton's perspective, can you tell us what that was by contrast, as a student of Parsons?
I think Morton think, I just know about the Morton's statement about the multiple discovery. And I'm not sure it's relevant or not.
Okay, it's a corollary, but in the 1940s, Merton did a paper on the sort of the 5 aspects of science, which were things like, and he used the word consciously, communism. Science shares everything, as in perfect communism. And then competition. I mean, I can't tell you off the top of my head what all 5 of them are, but he basically said these were the norms by which science works or should work. And in the minds of scientists, if you violate these, I mean, if you don't share information with other people, you try to falsify your data or something like that, you will be punished by the scientific community. And so he was then criticized by people who said, look at this laboratory in Cambridge in 1890. The director was not sharing information, and they were basically holding down people who had new ideas which were really right, and the director was wrong after long enough. So in that sense, what Merton did following Parsons in this general sense was to articulate values and norms by which the scientific community operated. And then there was a student here who showed, for instance, even if you were in a norm in a Cambridge, England lab, if you had a new paper, you wouldn't tell anybody in England about it. You'd send it to the US and you'd publish it in an American journal, and you might, or even under a different name, not your own name. And then when those papers got to be recognized as important, then you could become a new lab director or something else yourself without offending the lab. But so in a sense, there were ways that individuals can negotiate these constraints that they can't control, but can still be creative if you look for ways of handling it. So, what the PhD here did was to synthesize aspects, recognizing there are domineering, a highly authoritarian laboratory directors and chairmen of departments and university professors who can be very dogmatic for sure. But the point is, the scientific community as a whole doesn't tend to reward them. They tend to be more local. They tend to have more local reputations. They focus on money and promotion and firing people and hiring new people, etc., but not on ideas which will be discussed in China or in India or England or anywhere else. Okay, so yes. So in that sense, there are papers that have done this, and they can alert you to processes which you might not think of otherwise. But I mean, I maybe I shouldn't have said I read that work of Parsons. At the same time, I saw many of the weaknesses, but I would say the biggest weakness I saw was that it was just too vague, too loose. It didn't have sharp, specific propositions of the sort. That's why we're reading Stinchcombe and Blaylock. They show you at least an ideal way to map a theory is to have causal arrows coming in, going out, propositions, and then a context where you can again have boxes within boxes, which can be analogous to Parsons in that sense. But this is the way econometricians draw these things. They have nothing to do with, they don't cite Parsons at all. But I'm simply saying, this is science. It's a way of doing science. And in that sense, Parsons broke with Max Weber, whose tool, his big conceptual tool, he thought was the ideal type. And Parsons said, no, that's really out of date. We're much better off focusing on propositions, dynamic processes, and where and how they work. And that's what you've read about in Blaylock and Stinchcombe, and is seen as a shared goal of many. What else? What other big points should we bring in here? In this example, or to generalize this example just a little bit, Parsons he sought to codify the context. So he didn't write a book about the religion of India and of China and of ancient Judaism as Max Weber did. He tried to look at a higher level of generality, but at the same time try to see where and why it might vary. And then in his later work, some of the things that he especially wrote about were how could the whole society collapse if it didn't do things creatively or successfully, and makes the point that we can then talk about societies or within them political systems as being in competition, as being in a sort of evolutionary Darwinian kind of situation, but not a literal Darwinian one where people act like a Skinner rat, but instead evolution can and should include, and this was a revolution that happened, say, in the 70s or 80s, evolution can and should include, if we're dealing with human beings, it should include the best of their minds and the best of their hearts, as well as random behavior. And so, and core aspects of this include politics, economics, religion, values, and how these can be put together. And so Robert Bellah was a Parsons student who pushed this further. He did 2 big books really on this, of how the religious components of what he called the axial religions, AXIAL, the axial religions of Hindu, Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism. With these big religions have adapted and adapted and adapted over long hundreds and hundreds of years, where there've been many, many, many other religions or value orientations that have sort of been popular for a while, then they dropped out, like fascism. And so in that sense, how and why do certain kinds of life perspectives succeed better than others? And so this is an extension of legitimacy. It deals with the issues of trust. It deals with Putnam's discussions of bowling alone, that if we get to be too highly individualistic, we're not going to do other things with other people. Trust in the whole and trust and legitimacy in the whole political system can fall, and it's happening. I mean, that is, the surveys show people have less trust and they have less confidence in the political system. Most visible example in the U.S. is obviously Trump and the reactions against Donald Trump. But we have similar situations in Hungary and in India, and the Muslims fighting against the Hindus, when we have an openly Hindu prime minister imposing, and Myanmar, et cetera. That is, there are lots of places that are tougher to live in than Europe and the Western Europe and the U.S. these days. But I'm going to hold until after our break, and we can talk about political cultures, but I'm simply filling in a little bit of the background to say that his writings, and this is in the little book, there are these two little books at Prentice Hall. I'll just hold up for you if you haven't read them all yet. But sometime when you're on vacation and lying on a beach with nothing else to do, take a look at these two little books. So here's one called Societies, and here's the other. And one sort of goes back to Max Weber and history, not just the ideas of Weber, but the history of Europe and how that then came up to present. And then this is really evolutionary and comparative perspectives, which is what I'm summarizing more from Bella, and especially the religious battles and so forth. Or if you retire at 35, what are you going to do? Not just you personally who's writing about it, but what are all your friends who are on that website going to do? And so Parsons, in a sense, will say, you're going to need some of those other things. That is, you're going to have to say, what are we going to do? How will we do it? Do we have enough money? And money may be, I'm sure that's what a lot of this discussion is about. But with your successful folks from Hollywood, they're going to have plenty of money. Problem will be bigger than that. Any thoughts, Taylor?
I think you make a good point. It's a problem bigger than money. It's an unusual problem. I don't know. I don't have much to add on that actually right in this moment, but it's a good point.
But am I correct that you've been reading the social media discussion of these people who are saying, yes, let's retire at 35 or something like that? Do they articulate any kinds of arguments or concerns that might fall into these AGI-INL kinds of patterns, for instance?
They have a lot of concerns. They have social concerns, how they'll be received by family and friends, people who currently make work the central focus of their lives, like the majority of people in the world do. And some have concerns about keeping busy, absolutely, of going back to that kind of doing good work, staying busy kind of angle. So there are concerns attached with pursuing that alternative lifestyle. Yeah.
Okay, so for example, you could work very hard, make lots of money, and then retire at 35, but then say, I'm morally committed to making the world better, especially for poor people. And I want to do something about it for the rest of my life. So I'm going to either form or join a civic organization that does just this. And I may work just as many hours or more hours as I did when I was, a film assistant director in Hollywood, that I will be doing it for because I want to, not because I'm trying to make more money. Okay, and Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton are, in a sense, have done aspects of that. Tony Blair, and these are hard-working people, very goal-oriented. They retired from the presidency at a middle age, and they spent, or Bill Gates, they're doing a lot. I mean, I won't try to say that that they're only doing good works. Maybe they're trying to make a good reputation and make up for all those bad things they did in the past. And so I won't try to make that kind of point so much as to say they themselves and their own lifestyles, and there are many other people who are less famous that who can act that way. Other thoughts from your readings of these folks? And have you been surprised in anything that you've read in the last couple of weeks, say, for instance? I guess I'm indirectly asking, do you or they seem to have a sort of clear emotional, cognitive, cultural conception of what work is and what retirement is, or is it much more diffuse and multidimensional in the discussions you're reading?
Oh, me.
Yes. Or in what you're reading, not what you feel yourself, but in the people who are
Yeah. Yeah, I find the conversations really interesting. The debate about work, especially for people who have left like mandatory work, what then earns the definition of work. I really enjoy that strain of thought. So I saw on one social media comment, there was one person was like, if you're retired, what did you do on Saturday? And someone said, well, I worked. And the other person said, well, LOL, you're retired. What does that possibly mean? And the other person said, I had dishes, I had chores, I had to take my kid to a soccer game. So that was fun to see it play out in real time. We so often think of work only as a money-making enterprise, but it was nice to see that kind of complication in that discussion there.
Okay, great example. Good point. The other point I made briefly in the syllabus and haven't quite mentioned now is Parsons as well is not making up the general direction. That is, he sought explicitly to participate in the general, deeper transformation of science through the 20th and 21st century, and coming into the 21st century. For example, in denying the dichotomies and the ideal types of Max Weber, in stressing instead variables and propositions, and then the context within which they operated, the boxes within boxes, similar to what econometricians were doing when they were building models of the whole economy. He collaborated actively, I mentioned, with Bales, but he sought to create not a sociology department, but a social relations department, which was broader, which included psychology, anthropology, bits of history, and in that way, organizationally, that wasn't important, but what was important was the ideas percolating up from these multiple overlapping fields could be addressed better if you see the connection. So I guess it was Yi-Ling Lin commented that innovations often now come from adjoining fields, not from just one narrow field, but from different specializations. As the world in science, as well as literature, get more and more and more specialized, we can learn by looking at people who we don't normally read or talk to or look at the pictures from or whatever. And so in the same way, Parsons was trying to learn from and have joint seminars, joint books, joint projects where people would be challenged and could disagree, but at the same time learn from one another. And so a critical, I mean, so a sort of a statement of this would be personality, social structure, and culture are interdependent elements of the same kinds of systems. So what's in your head is part of your body in terms of health or physiology, but it's also part of your personality. What's in your head is part of your personality, but also of your national background, your family, your father who used to say, do more of this, and your mother would say, I'll love you just the same, even if you don't, et cetera, et cetera. And so these multiple things come together, social structure, personality, and culture, in ways that no one really said and tried to articulate coherently before Parsons. And so joining with these multiple people, like Bales as a social psychologist and Clifford Geertz as an anthropologist, Kroeber, and then people who were doing studies of villages where there are Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and sort of Yankee Americans in the same village, and then looking at where and how they have said they're the same climate, the same occupations, they're all farmers, the same isolation from the rest of the world, but they're very, very different. And so seeing in that kind of quasi-experimental context, how culture drives to ignore some things and really play up others in ways that are not reducible to these kinds of those other factors. That's example of the kind of research which people like Fred Strodbeck here did with people at Harvard in pursuing this kind of, that is, if I saw it, and I would say many people would see, and this obvious weakness of Parsons is it's too loose, it's too general, it's too vague. Many follow-up participants would not ignore Parsons. They would say, don't take it as fixed or final. Take it as something to begin with, and then go further, make it better, make it more scientific, which was his goal. That is, in contrast, there are a lot of people, even in universities, whose goal is not to do science. I don't mean people in the humanities. Some people in the humanities do want to do sort of science, but I'm talking more about the so-called postmodernists, the Parisian theorists who would say, there is no science. The only thing to do is shout at each other, or what's in one person's head is so unique that you can't generalize about it, and therefore there's no point in trying to do any kind of experiment or anything else. That kind of perspective you could see elements of even within as brilliant a mind as Clifford Geertz, whereas Levi-Strauss, and we'll talk about this next week, Levi-Strauss said the opposite. Okay, so I'm saying in that kind of debate, Parsons was on the side of science. So if he could see other people building on his work, going beyond it, doing it better and more scientifically, I would say he would cheer. And in many respects, this has happened, even if many of the people don't cite Parsons. You mentioned, I read a lot of these ideas somewhere, but never heard about Parsons before. Okay. So there's a lot of what we do today, we take for granted. We may cite other people, but put differently, he consolidated much of social science from the dogmatism, the battles, the overstatements, the one-factor determinisms of 19th century social thought, from Marx, from Darwin, from the the racial determinists, the geographic determinists. It's all climate. Northern Europe is different from Southern Europe because people in the South, where it's warm, you talk to each other more, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we had all these theories, and Parsons sort of pulled them together and said, well, we need aspects of all of these things, but don't let them be deterministic. And so that multi-causality, but also not looking for randomness, looking for things which do have a dynamic process driving them, which we can understand if we study it more closely. Even if we can't understand it everywhere, maybe the next generation will. Teo, you gave us a challenge at the beginning. Any thoughts before we take a break for us to ponder for a few minutes? You've been silent so far. Are you on mute?
No, so I was actually vigorously writing down what you just said because things are starting to click a little bit more. And I did read Parsons as, as pushing for multi-causal analyses, and a lot of what he was dealing with, a lot of the literatures that he was engaging were reductionist in some sense or another. So that, I mean, that brings up a new challenge entirely, as you mentioned, and that question of what if I missed something? What if I, is there another process, another mechanism that I'm missing that I haven't thought of, that someone else hasn't written about? And maybe that just comes from the innate desire to solve a problem that's in front of you completely and perhaps on your own. But I guess that overwhelming aspect of social science research is, I'm trying to think, how to apply this specifically to the sociology of culture, because I'm only thinking about it in very general terms, but it feels like something that I've been trying to grapple with in my own projects. And that really, I think, was the reason I struggled even to get started in the first place, because I didn't know where to start because of, the difficulty in identifying all of the different factors that are moving, whether it be, at the social psychological scale, at the structural level. Reading Foucault confuses anyone. So not really a comment, nothing to be built on, but just a thought based on what you just told us about Parsons.
Yeah, remind the others what you're working on for your MA.
I'm working on far-right discourse in American society. Okay.
So if we think in a sense of social movements, new social movements, I mean, these are very new according to the media, but they have roots historically, or more generally, they have aspects of their dynamics which may be similar to the Boy Scouts or to Mao on the Long March, or to the or the Klan, etc. And so trying to see what were the dynamics which were similar or different from those, I would say is very much in the line of the way that Parsons would be suggesting you could use what he wrote about. So you're taking notes and seeing those kinds of connections. I think he would applaud your writing them down. Stinchcomb, maybe not in the chapter that I attached, but Stinchcomb has written a lot about functional analysis, and he has a long section, I think even a bit is in that selection I sent, saying that many of Marx's ideas were functionalist. And so to say functionalism is Parsonian and therefore it's conservative and therefore it's wrong, is what some people did in the late 60s. But Stinchcomb, writing in Berkeley in the late 60s, could see clearly enough that there was plenty of functionalism in Marx's own writings. And so he identified them one by one by one. So here's a Marxian proposition, which is functionalist in that sense. So in that, I'm responding here to Alan's sort of question at the beginning of about the ideas. All right, we're at 6:02. Let's have a 15-minute break. So we'll reconvene at 6:17. See you soon. Okay. Yeah, everybody's there. Almost. Our second section is now focusing more on the political system, political culture, and a couple of different, somewhat contradictory or complementary sources. Let me just slide my boxes around so I can look at some of this. Schills we talk about as the senior figure in a lot of this. Who knows anything about Edward Schills? He's co-editor with Parsons of the fat book, Theories of Society, but anybody run into it? What do you know about him? Anybody? Or maybe nothing. How many know nothing? Almost nothing. Okay. Anybody? What? Just tell us. Well, okay. Don't want to stress that too long, but basically, he came here in the 30s. Or let me start back. He was a poor Jewish guy in Philadelphia, very smart. And he would go to the library of the University of Pennsylvania, and he'd read everything he could find that was in sort of social theory area. He came to the University of Chicago, didn't have enough money to pay the tuition, so he got a job as a social worker mostly in Woodlawn, just south of the university, Black area. And he at the same time that he was reading, and he was amazed with the quality of the mind of Max Weber. So while Parsons was translating Max Weber in Cambridge, Schills was translating Max Weber in Chicago. And then they began to learn about each other a little bit. And then the war came along. And Schills went with a grad student named Morris Janovitz to London. And the Allies captured the letters that German troops were sending back to their families. And so the British and the Americans wanted to know, how should we be bombing the Germans to stop the war as soon as possible? What would you do if you were in that situation? Okay, Schills and Janovitz read the letters. They came from Max Weber and all this background and all kinds of other things. And they were impressed with the degree to which even the letters would talk about the closeness of feeling that the German troops had with each other in a small working unit. Even though they argued, some were higher or lower in education, income, travel, whatever else. Others were from North or South Germany. There were Protestants, there were Catholics, but being together, forced to be together, and if they didn't do it just right, they could all be dead. They knew that every minute that they were there, and they developed, and so they discovered this. Then they tried to look at how much were they hearing back from their families that, oh, our town, our neighborhood was bombed. It's disastrous. Tell Hitler to stop, or let's stop the war. Say, we're not going to fight for this anymore. The bombing was too bad. Did they get that kind of letter? No. So basically, they concluded bombing doesn't do any good. You're wasting your time bombing those German cities. The morale comes from the troops on the front. And when they said this, they published, morale in the Wehrmacht, the salience of the primary group, nobody believed them. The army, especially the army troops, the bombers said, oh no, you're saying all these bomb cities in England and Germany are just a waste of time and money? And then rebuilding them? We were wrong? We were wrong? How can you say that? Okay. And Shills and Janovich said, yes, you were wrong. Okay. This led to what's been called the rediscovery of the primary group in the 1940s and 50s. And to look at, and so it happened, it started in the 30s. There was a Harvard Business School group that studied one of the biggest factories in America. Was called the Western Electric Company in the west side of Chicago, southwest side. They made telephones, and people put them together, and they tried to figure out how could they make the people work better, harder, more efficiently, make more money for the company, and so forth. And they found that trying to help with one person didn't matter. You had to deal with the primary group, the work team that worked together. Okay, so then that became in the military, Harvard Business School. Then there was I mentioned George Homans was a young sociologist with Parsons. Homans wrote a book called The Human Group, and said, the more people talk to each other, the more they like each other. That's his proposition. X leads to Y. Almost nothing else. He says this for 250 pages or something like that. He has lots of examples and so forth, but that's the idea. It's not Buddhism. It's not Chinese nationalism. It's who you talk to. Maybe via social media, maybe over Zoom, maybe at a bar in person, but maybe not. Okay, so Shills then didn't end there. This was just the beginning. So he put this together. And so I mentioned Bales at Harvard was coding people when they talked in a room. This was Shills's version of what Bales was doing. And then they were reading psychoanalysis to look at Freud and these more abstract, bigger concepts of guilt and repression and so forth. And then to join this with cultural conceptions of guilt and repression, not just the psychoanalytic part of your head. And so basically, Shills and Parsons were independently coming to the same kind of big interdependent, interrelated subsystems. And specifically, Shills created something called the Committee for the Comparative Study of the New Nations, in part because he stayed in London for a while. He was teaching at LSE and then later at Cambridge, as well as teaching at Chicago. So he had a sense of how he went to India a lot. He went to Pakistan. He was in Africa and in mostly British colonies. And then Gabriel Allman did a PhD on New York City, who was working on similar kinds of concerns as Shills, working with initially a Chicago, then a national organization called the Social Science Research Council. And it brought together and gave grants for people to collaborate as a small group, but they transformed and created really modern political science and different aspects of joining the developed and less developed worlds. And they didn't study, in the old days, it was called law or public law, public administration, something like that. It became political science. And some people at Harvard especially resisted the term, said, we're not a science, we do theorizing or something like that. These folks, Allman, Coleman, Verba, Converse, and others really created contemporary political science, which was really political culture and sociology. Robert Dahl, Philip Converse at Michigan, Dahl at Yale. Gabriel Allman was at Chicago, then at Princeton, then at Yale, then at Stanford. And they together with Shills, Clifford Geertz, David Apter, who was a political scientist at Chicago. Now I guess maybe he was in Chicago briefly, but they created this group that tried to codify how one could join especially non-Western categories of culture, for instance, like deference to senior family members. Alex Inglis at Harvard analogously worked on adding new concepts like clientelism and party hierarchy in comparing Soviet, then worldwide components of economic innovation that he measured in surveys that could drive or retard development in poor countries. So he talked about things like achievement motivation, trying to implement what you want. How much are you really willing to work hard and to do that? Or would you just complain that, if the weather's not good, I can't do it and the gods aren't with me, so maybe I'll never get what I want. So he had questions to try to capture the degree to which different political cultures reflected these alternative ways of doing things. Shills writes about this somewhat explicitly in the epilogue to the book that we're sort of the main thing that we're using as lots of little tidbits and snippets. This is one of the longest selections in Theories of Society is the epilogue by Shills, where he really talks about being in Chicago, being actively involved with all the Chicago field work, the tradition as he did in his social work, and yet at the same time saying, this is not the future of social science. We've got to go further. We got to be far more ambitious. We got to join the primary groups with the personality, with the broader context of the whole society and its culture. And this same kind of perspective was something which Aaron Wildavsky, Wildavsky created the public policy school at Berkeley, explicitly challenging the narrowness of public administration and public policy in most other universities. Harvard did descriptive case studies in the law school, the business school, public policy, or most of the rest of the programs in public policy just did narrow evaluations. His own work was on how budgets are made as a core decision of governments, which he studied for half his life. And he had a theory called incrementalism, which is you do the same thing as last year plus another bit, and then you sort of allocate it to all the different agencies, more or less as you did before. But there are no revolutions. There are no real major changes. It's sort of like the lab in Cambridge. Then along came 1978. It's called Proposition 13. A couple of people said taxes are too high in California. We're gonna, and then the citizens of California make the decisions because we're gonna have a proposition which citizens can vote on. And if they vote on it, it will become law, not like Illinois or Chicago or China. Okay, so 1978 Proposition 13 passed. Property taxes in California, it passed by 2/3 of the citizens of California, and property taxes were cut by half immediately. This was the flagship of what was called the Taxpayers' Revolt. For Wildavsky, it said, my theory is shattered. That life continues being the same way in incremental budgeting. No, it just was destroyed by Prop 13. So he said, I've got to have a new theory. I'm in my 40s or whatever he was. And so he started reading around and he looked for what to do. And he found a woman named Mary Douglas, who was the leading British analog of Levi-Strauss in France and Geertz in the US. And she wrote about food and other aspects of Western lifestyle. And breaking with the great British tradition of local field work in the colonies. And she developed what was called the grid group fourfold typology, AGIL. Take a look at this. Let's see if I can show you this. And let me click on, this up a little higher. There we go. Share screen. Okay, so here we've got Douglas and Vildovsky's grid group typology of worldviews. 4 rationalities: the fatalist, the hierarchist, the individualist, and the egalitarian. And the grid and the group were things that she developed starting with tribes and villages in Africa and other places. And then she began to compare with other parts of the world. And she said, you know, these things can be, and so the fourfold typology was widely used in these years. It was also used with Paul Lazarsfeld at Columbia and adding numbers to these. They measured these things as well. But Vildovsky and Douglas used these things used them for a couple of decades and all kinds of books. So here's Mary Douglas. And the grid and the group can be codes. They can be authority identified, rationality, personal or codes, and sort of in the degree of abstraction in terms of who's regulating this. Is it highly personalistic or is it an abstraction? And then self-regulating, persons, skills, didactic or not. And then over here, we've got the isolate, the positional, the individualist, and the enclave. The 3 heroes of grid group slots. And they exemplify as well Max Weber's 3 types of rationality. Okay. So I won't try to go through too much of this in detail, except to say you can play with this kind of typologizing of, and you look at, this is from a book. You see the range of themes which are touched on here. Atomized subordination, ascribed hierarchy, individualism, and factionalism. So then fatalism, the ununionized weaver, hierarchy, the high caste Hindu villager, egalitarianism, the communard, and individualism, the self-made manufacturer. Okay, this is more close to lots of sort of contemporary examples. And here are little pictures if you want to do network analysis. This is what it should look like. And this is the way that Vildovsky used it more often. And here we have specific issues, gun control, etc. So in a sense, thinking of ways of taking a core set of ideas and applying them to different cultural contexts. This is very much analogous to AGIL, and clearly they'd read AGIL, they knew about Parsons, as well as, I'll just point here to 2 other German names on this page, Luhmann and Habermas, who were similarly writing and thinking about systems in ways that were analogous to Parsons and other people. That is, the physicists of this era and computer scientists, which were just taking off, talked about feedback systems and how if you had the system break down, how could it get started again? And then And then you would change. How would you learn? You'd try something else. And the feedback that the next time period you might solve that problem would show you the changes in what you needed to draw on to solve the problem. So Norbert Wiener did a famous book, MIT guy, on this kind of systems pattern. All right, so I'm going through people who were modeling or remodeling the core ideas of political science. And I haven't gone through all, but the other big one, which in a sense was a contrast with these, was really highly individualistic. And it was Philip Converse and his associates at the University of Michigan. So whereas Lazarsfeld, growing out of this focus on the community, and he'd done the same thing in Vienna in the 30s, before 33, he saw how a village just sort of narrowed its perspectives in the Depression, and he sensed, or he saw from sort of personal fieldwork, how much this was a collective phenomenon. Just like the primary group in the Wehrmacht. So when he came to the US, he looked for things like this. And although he'd been a neo-Marxist social democrat working for the revolution in Vienna, when he came to the US, he said, my God, the driver is women shopping for food and clothes. That's the paradigm of everything. So he started doing marketing research and doing the first national or big surveys, but he didn't do national surveys. He surveyed communities, small towns or villages or people who shop together. And then if you might have, say, 3 or 4 women who'd shop every Saturday afternoon, they'd have lunch together, they'd look at a couple of places for shoes. And one woman would say, yes, the blue shoes are really the best on you. Then they'd have a snack. They'd talk again, say, who you're going to vote for president. And the one who read the newspapers the most would be the one they would listen to. That was called the 2-step theory of communication. That the 4 women did not independently watch television or read a newspaper and make up their minds or not. They deferred to the one who really knew the most, who they knew well and felt they had an empathy toward the good taste of that one person, and they trusted her. So Lazarsfeld basically stressed trying to incorporate these in everything we do, whether it's shopping for tomato soup or doing questionnaire surveys about bombing cities. And so I want to push on and say Lazarsfeld, Lipset, Barton, Lintz started this kind of work at Columbia, and it continued with people at Michigan who took a more individualistic, Parsons would call utilitarian perspective. And it then led to surveys of national samples of American citizens, and then the same thing in other countries of the world, but it lost the communal primary group. And so that has been coming back in different ways ever since. But I'm talking about the sort of foundations of political culture and how they varied in different universities and different teams. And then this changed even more after 1968, when Parsons had these troubles, as I talked to you about them. And so what tended to become more important for many younger political scientists was what was called then now rational choice or public choice or rationality. And for a while, it was very dogmatic, very dominant. It was places like Stanford, Virginia, and it still has some people who do that. But basically today, for the most part, you find, if in the American Political Science Review, others internationally, you'll find mixtures of culture, rational choice individualism, and then more traditional law, and then political theory in the sense of Machiavelli or Hobbes or James Madison on up, and then what's called IR. And so you have these different sub-branches of political science, but the point was they fight among themselves in terms of how important is the choice of one person versus the collectivity, and how can we map these and then measure them. And so these are the parts from which political culture was constructed, and people are still sharpening. Inglehart played a major role, and so as these things were just coming together, I saw them and I knew people that these were not on the programs of the APSA or the IPSA or the sociologists. Why not? Was it the ideas or was it the political context? How could we compare the two? And we have, see, we'll flip back to, just turn this off. Alan's question, the bottom line question, is this a history of ideas or is this the context of the ideas? And I would suggest it was more the context of the ideas, in the sense that linking with diversity today, linking with this week in Minneapolis and the coverage, Patrick Moynihan, Harvard professor, US Senator from New York, author of a major book with, we saw little bits of Arguing the World. He was a collaborator with what's his name? Glazer, Nathan Glazer, and Moynihan did a book on ethnic groups in New York, or ethnic groups in America, starting off from New York, which they knew best. After 1968, with the riots, which were like the 2020 last summer's riots, looting, shouting, some political speeches, often no political speeches, and they happen in all the big cities and so they started out, okay, but basically spread. So Moynihan was invited by, I've forgotten what is a major agency group to do a report on what were the causes of this violence and what can we do to make America better. And he did a report, and he talked, and the committee, it was a committee of experts from across the country. And one thing they talked about, many different factors were important, but one thing they mentioned, one factor, was the Black family. And sometimes it wasn't a family. There were more so-called broken families. There were more single mother households where the father was not present, and that this could lead to more difficulty in raising children and lead to different definitions of norms. Think of AGI&L. Okay, the Moynihan report became infamous because of what I summarized from it. And there was for example, a Black caucus of the American Sociological Association condemned it. And for roughly 20 years, there were virtually no sociologist ever wrote a paper on the Black family. It was just too hot and too politically sensitive to talk about or to do research on. That changed with Bill Wilson here, William Julius Wilson, when he had the courage to say, let's pay attention to the Black family. It's an important component of what we're doing, and so we ought to study it. And then he went one step further, that he nevertheless started from a neo-Marxist background. He talked about the corporation, the job, the factory, work. That's what drives the life of poor people. He did lots of books which stress this again and again in different ways. Then Barack Obama won the nomination, and Bill Wilson was an advisor along with Hillary Clinton. No, it was not Hillary Clinton. He worked with Hillary Clinton before that, but just reach for it here. No, I'm not getting it quite right. Bill Wilson did a book basically saying, it's time to forget the Moynihan Report. It's time to study Black culture, Black family culture, because if we don't, we're just cutting off our fingers. We're not understanding what's going on. And second, we have a new incoming president who wants to formulate national, urban, and social policies which will help the disadvantaged. And if we can't target those things like sickle cell disease, certain aspects of lifestyle, which are especially troublesome for the health and lives of African Americans, we will not be spending our money wisely in national government policies. So he went through, it's a 150-page book saying, let's bring culture back in, let's do it, and let's target it toward policy. And sociologists and social scientists, psychologists, and others ought to do this together. Okay. This in turn illustrates the degree to which the Moynihan Report was an external factor transforming away from or labeling some things as simply something you can't talk about. So in that era before Bill Wilson published his book, I met some other people and I said, why don't we meet in our private room? Let's get a hotel room at one of these political sociology conferences, and we'll just meet. And said, yeah, let's do that. And they were Daniel Elazar, Aaron Vildovsky, Ron Engelhardt, forgetting one person, but basically we had 4 people. And we met for about 6 or 8 years every year. And then we bring along some other people as well. And we talked about culture and how political culture could and should be built into a solid core. And these were the kinds of things which we were discussing in those meetings. Then Vildovsky became president of the American Political Science Association. And he got a little bit arrogant, I have to say. And so he didn't just want to talk with the others. He wanted his view. He wanted us to do it the way he was doing it. And so it led to the group saying, well, go ahead, Aaron, do it that way. And by the way, we're now on the programs officially anyway. We don't just have to meet in our private hotel rooms. Lots of people are talking about this. And so political culture today has become much more widespread. But my point is, it was very important in the 60s. It went down in the 70s and 80s, then it came back up again, not for internal reasons, had nothing to do with the quality of the ideas. It was all to do with the politics of the Moynihan Report and things like that. And the label of that was, don't blame the victim. Studying the culture of the Black family is blaming the victim, and we don't want to do that. So Bill Wilson said, and you're not blaming the victim. We've got to understand the victim's problems if we're going to cure them, for God's sake. Okay, but he had a blacker face than me, so he could write that in ways that I could not. But it's happened, and culture is now much more front and center. And so I would say, in addressing the concerns, whether they're in Minneapolis or police or whatever, we can use cultural ideas creatively. We can use them in studying the groups that were storming the Congress in Washington. We can use them in studying feminism or Chinese nationalism, but they don't have to be the way they were used in the past. You can and should adapt them for new topics and purposes. Okay, so that's my quick overview. Let me just add one more example of contemporary stuff, which is a different side. Not too long ago, under COVID, there was an exchange between Mitch McConnell, the US Senate Republican leader, and Cuomo, who before his scandal is the governor of New York. And McConnell followed the book by Donald Trump called The Art of the Deal, where Trump advocates an explicit utilitarian contract between where separate contracts can be made, ignoring their interrelation or broader potential connections. Or he can try to frame life this way, even if others try to counter it with different frames. Specifically, the Republican leaders countered Governor Cuomo of New York, who asked for more money due to the coronavirus crisis. And McConnell suggested a policy option for New York or other states was declare bankruptcy. Cuomo came back and shifted the frame in debate, almost citing Parsons when he replied that bankruptcy was a disastrous suggestion because it would undermine the trust and the creditworthiness initially in the individual state if it sought to borrow in the future, either for money or votes. More broadly, expanding the frame or raising to a higher Parsonian level, it would deflate the national economic and political systems by undermining the confidence of citizens and leaders and in the minds of other countries and what they felt about the US and future international dealings. To counter such problems, which he saw in past thinking from Bentham and others, Parsons challenged these utilitarians by labeling this sort of thinking the utilitarian fallacy in 1937, based on its short-term effort to get the most from the present resources, ignoring the system-wide workings and the broader values like general confidence that were at stake. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. Let me add one more piece of political culture, extending the same kind of comment there to the lead work by the lead political scientist at the time was Robert Dahl. And Dahl in his great book called Who Governs has some discussion in an earlier book with Harold Lasswell called Power, studied the best thinking about power and how it worked. And basically they concluded that Dahl was misleading and had a silly, irresponsible definition of power, which was if A and B are together and B does something different because A says do so, that's the exercise of, that's power. It's a dyadic relationship between two people. Okay, what can you think about from what we've been discussing Parsons that would lead you to say that's wrong? Parsons said, don't think that way at all. Think of power as analogous to money in the economy, and that money is a circulating medium. And if you have more of it, everybody can get richer. If you have less and there's less confidence and the GNP goes down in a business cycle or a recession, everyone gets poor. Not every single person to the same degree, but there's a big system-wide effect. But the main point was, this is how politics works. If you have confidence in your leaders and you're marching and you're in France and in 1805, you're still so overwhelmed with the 1789 revolution. You're so proud to be French that you want to take equality, fraternity to the rest of the world. And so with Napoleon, you say, yes, I'll volunteer to be in his army. We want to help Germany get out of its feudal era. And so there was such high morale in the French army that they conquered all of Europe. They got all the way to Moscow. The Russians, again, were smart. They basically burned the city of Moscow so that when the Napoleonic troops came in, they didn't have to occupy it outside like the Nazis. When the Napoleonic troops got there, there was no food, no people, nothing left. So they basically starved, and then that was, and they lost, etc. But basically, confidence in the political system is a huge resource, and that is the foundation of a resource exchange, which needs to be seen as a systemic property and analyzed as part of the whole process, not looking at what does one person have in his or her mind climbing the wall behind Donald Trump as the television is running. Okay, so I will stop there after having, I hope, provoked a little bit, and let's discuss ways we can connect this to more or critique the ideas in their own right. Or if you haven't been inspired to read on about money and power and circulation, or universities, or angry students fighting against meritocracies, or changing and thinking about Chinese nationalism, maybe you'll read at least those little bits of Parsons, even if you don't like what you read so far. He has 4 papers, and it's a separate book on power, which much, I think a lot of it may have been after this Theories of Society, because it's not so, there are bits of it there in what we had you could read, but more of it is later on. Reactions. I didn't say much, actually, yeah, I didn't say much about Elazar or some of the readings. Anybody read one of those you want to tell us about, we can talk about? The Elazar 1 chapter is the key focal reading. What did Elazar say there? Nobody can answer, that's a bad sign. This is not supposed to be a lecture course.
A question about the syllabus. Were the 2-star readings or the 1-star readings meant to be the focal?
The more stars, the more important. Sometimes it's called focal when we just have one, but there's, and I think in this case, Elazar is the only, is the main reading for the political culture area.
Oh my, okay. I focused on the 1-star thinking that was the more important one. So I read those chapters. My apologies.
Okay, now go ahead. Tell us about what's in the 1-star. we can build up to the 2. Unless, is there anybody else nobody's looked at Elazar? Okay, let's get the idea. I'll say 2 words and just to get them out. Then we can come back to the 2-star, to the whatever else you've looked at. Elazar's simple theory, in a word, is that culture is what you carry on your back. And if you migrate from ancient Israel, Jerusalem, and you go into the Egyptian desert, and you may be enslaved by the Egyptians for years and years, generations, you still come back and you're still the same Jew. And then on the way back, just crossing over into Israel, led by Moses, God called Moses to the mount and left him as he came back to the people with the 10 commandments. That's the archetypical example that Elazar uses of the compact society, the society joined in a constitution with God as the prime foundation. It's not just among people, it's not just a law, it's a God-given form of joining the people together. And unlike Donald Trump, or Rousseau, even Rousseau, or John Stuart Mill, or people who would talk about contracts in individualistic manner. This was a holistic conception that joined everyone into a unity of which God was an ethereal, overwhelming, dominant component. And when he studied the constitutions of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, they all look that way. When he went to New York, they never mentioned God. They talk about exchange, individualism, things like markets. So Wall Street is a middle Atlantic conception of a political culture, which is drastically different, in conflict with the New Englanders. And when he went down and looked at the constitutions of North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, no God, no exchange, respect, hierarchy. It was a slave system. And the hierarchy of the early English settlers was assembled in England before they left. They hired someone who could make, who could be the cobbler, another person who could be a cook, another person who knew how to chop cotton, another person, etc. And they had the right numbers for each of these. And the people who did the hard work were called indentured servants. They were all white Englishmen, but they'd stolen a cup from a dinner table or something like that. And so they had 10 years to work off their indentured servitude, and others were indentured for life. But they were there, and then 50 years later, they became black with the black slave trade. But the feudal institution of slavery was the foundation in the American South. Then as you had the people who arrived at the New England, Middle Atlantic, and South, moved westward on the frontier, you had three different frontiers. But nevertheless, if you look at people in Bill Gates's Seattle today, they're closer to New Englanders who are doing good works, as big Bill Gates thinks he's doing with his wife, at least, than to people who went from Middle Atlantic, who went to San Francisco, where in San Francisco, they don't talk about doing good works to that same degree at all. Or in the South, if you look at LA or Houston or Oklahoma along the way, you have these three different brands of political culture. That was a couple of 100 years ago. Do these things persist and make any difference today? One study did this in the counties of Indiana, and found that the people who were the original settlers in these North, Middle, and South counties of Indiana explained better the tax burdens, the welfare benefit levels, the school spending of those different counties. And those, by contrast, were not related either at all or much less strongly to the income, education, occupation, religious background, poverty levels of the current residents. So political culture can be several hundred years old and operate in ways that you don't realize is operating because it may not be related to the people around you. Okay, question. Theo.
Yeah, maybe I'm asking this only because I haven't read that piece yet, but by which mechanisms, I mean, let me start off this way. Given how much change, in terms of immigration, in terms of, economic change, structural change, political change that goes on in these places over the course of a few hundred years, by which mechanisms are these political cultures sustained, or how? Yeah, I suppose that's my question.
Sure. No, that's a fundamental question. And Elazar would agree. They do change, and they're changing faster now than they did in the past. So he came to me and said, Terry, let's do a book together, because he wanted to join, because I published a book just has one star in this section called The New Political Culture. It has 20 propositions. And political culture is a dependent variable. That is, everything is there to explain how and why culture changes, whereas he's saying the opposite. He's looking at why culture persists. So the idea was to put both of these together, and we'd have a more powerful theory about both the causes and the consequences of different cultures. So the answer, even in his mind at that point, was for sure they change, but where and why and how much. And so he'd done on his own. I think he published 3 books on Illinois towns. He went back to the same towns. He got a PhD here, and then he taught at Urbana for 6 years or so. And he wrote his first book, which really featured these all within the state of Illinois. Then he studied about 10 towns or so. So he went back to these same 10 towns 10, 20 years later, 30 years later, and wrote more books on how and why they persist, or in some cases, they did change. So he's got lots of rich case study kind of material answering your question. And I would not say there's any one answer, so much as to say that even though they were changing, the striking finding that I cited about the Indiana counties was there's a lot of persistence. And if you've lived in only one part of the US, you may not realize that, but I grew up living, and being exposed to all 3 of these cultures in a powerful way, and being in shock and, not knowing in my own mind what was right or wrong, etc. So how many of you have lived in more than 2 of those regions, or more than one of those regions? Who want to offer us a contrast? And okay, yeah, go ahead. Do you see a contrast between these regions within the US you want to tell us about?
In fact, it's not about religions. It's just in
Yeah,
because
regions. Yeah, regions, not religions.
Regions. Okay,
Yeah.
regions. So it's from I come from China. So when I was in China, I was born in Sichuan, a province, and then I studied get my university education in Beijing, and then I come to the United States, and now I'm living in Chicago. So basically, I live in 3 regions, and each for more than 4 years. No, 4 years, 2 years at least. Yeah, and I think just talk about the different provinces that I live in China. I found out that when I was in different cities, the traditions in that city, and also how we interact with the citizens in the city is different. And for example, when I was in Chengdu, I studied in Chengdu, and the people live very they have a very easygoing life, I think. Yeah, but when I'm in Beijing, the a path of the life is much more quickly. So I have a personal observation about the beat of the city, the how far or how slow people's life in, and I found the beat of Chengdu is much more slower than that in Beijing. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I think Wenmu, didn't you also study in Chengdu? No. Okay. No, I'm confusing something else. All right. Now I did a 15-minute video that I'll just mention was watched in the time a week before, was arranged to be 1 week before the national government and party meetings and the creation of the 5-year plan. And there were 10 million people who watched the video, and there were 60 million who watched summaries of it. And a week later, the 5-year plan used the word scenes, which was what I was stressing, repeatedly in several places. So basically, the point of this is we featured Chengdu had 15 million visitors, where in the month of February, 1 week, Beijing and Shanghai had less than 10. and one was 10, and I think Shanghai was 5. So Chengdu has been very successful in attracting people, and they have been, and they, so they're, so the point of this was to say, cities in China are explicitly looking for ways to build a consumption economy, and they want to transform their culture and their values. And the idea is not just to do it randomly or cheaply, but to do it with taste and subtlety and cultural sensitivity. And Chengdu has done this more explicitly and consciously than any other city in China, with branches of the city government. And it's a big city. So, it's something like, 15 million. So yes, I mean, that's the general point, that yes, there's continuity, but there's also change, and where and how are what are both aspects of political culture. So instead of saying they're both there, I mean, I wouldn't say that, I mean, that in a sense that doesn't have any potential for causal modeling. If we try to say, what was it in, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and then what changes, and do new kinds of people get attracted by virtue of that, or are others driven away? These things are happening, or does the success? And so in some of my other courses, we pursue these in much more specific empirical detail, such as the mayor of Oklahoma City was overweight, and he found out that so were most of the other residents of Oklahoma City. So he went on a campaign to get people walking and eating more healthy food. And the whole people in the whole city took off millions of pounds of fat, and they were very successful. So even at that level of individual lifestyle, a mayor and government, not through forceful, you'll go to jail or be fined if you don't do it, but through positive use of parks and recreation areas, flowers, walking, new things to do, new people to visit, it became a very successful policy. So I'm not, my point in these examples is not to say there's any one right answer to how do things change. There are lots of answers, and that's what we're looking at different sections of the course, but they do change. And so both Elazar is right, and many of my propositions the other way are right. But if we put them both together, we'll have a stronger analysis than if we just have one or the other. Culture is both an independent and a dependent variable. But if we look at it over time with feedback, we can see how the mechanisms are operating in detail. And if we repeat these analyses in places like China and France and see how they differ, or the different regions of the US, then we can see more specifically how and why the context changes the way the dynamics work. That's at least the aspiration. Who's been quiet today and who might say a word? Wenbin?
Am I supposed to answer what you just said?
What have you learned today?
I definitely think the transition from the single deterministic view to the multi-factors view proposal by the Pearsons is very helpful for me to understand, because I think many of the works have been overstressing the one determinist's view. And I think taking different factors into consideration definitely helps me to understand how society works. And
yeah, for sure, that's a major point that you see again and again. But I didn't invent it. This was the beginning of the 20th century. It's just gotten implemented more and more thoroughly and extensively. Not just. Okay, go ahead. What else?
I have a small question.
Sure.
When you discuss the problem of power, because you mentioned that power is not, we can, this additional view send a dyadic relationship, and we can see as a power as a circulating media, as the kind of resources. But I feel like in specific cases of everyday life, we encounter power through one-to-one or in this kind of very concrete relationship. And I just want to know, how should we reconcile just kind of one-to-one everyday occasion of power dynamics with this kind of view of power as the currencies that are circulating across different factors in society? I just feel a little bit confused on this view.
Who else wants to answer that? I bet others can answer that if you think about it. Someone is a chat. You want to mention that, Teo, or you want to keep it? Yeah, oh yeah, you sent it to everyone. I think the perspectives course in the MAPS program might lead us to such a trap, at least given how the curriculum is structured. Okay, I don't know that specific course, but there are many courses at the USC even that certainly are taught that way, alas. And they don't tell you that all these things explain about 20%. Race, class, gender, national origin, age, political party, etc. So yes, we need to be more modest, multi-causal, but why don't we leave that as a question for everyone to think about, and then let's maybe try to talk about it next week. But ask yourself, where and why might that conception of power be more appropriate or less appropriate, or more visible or less visible? That is, doll A and B versus power as a systemic circulating medium. And if you want to read a little bit of either one, that's fine too. All right, well, I'll leave you there. We'll stay
Quick
with office
question.
hours.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
There weren't any focal readings for part 2 of next week, which I think is geared. So just wanted to ask you which the focal readings were, because there's Levi Strauss for the first part. Nothing specified.
Right, yeah, righto. Now I read. I looked, but basically, I spent more times reading Goetz and then writing that section than almost anything else. And it's damn hard to put your finger on something that is really ideal. So I would say, read more of what you didn't read this week, and dip into any bit of Goetz if you want, but don't. But what I guess I'm also saying, what I said there briefly, he considered his career was a disastrous failure. So don't read what he says was a failure. Don't waste your time on the second half, which was where he was lamenting the field of anthropology, its assumptions, all of this stuff. But he's still a brilliant guy, and he did great stuff at the beginning when he was closer to Parsons and he was closer to Levi Strauss and doing actual social science. So what I refer to, the weddings, the funeral ceremonies of people in Java, I refer to the royal progress of the English kings and queens within England or the British Empire. I'd say if you're interested in some of that, dig into it. If you're not, there are plenty of things which are starred and you haven't read them. Read those things as rather than some. That is, I would say, because he's smart, and to see where and why some smart people are doing the wrong things, there are reasons to read on in Goetz. But I would say where you are now, if you haven't read the things which you've been frank enough to say you haven't read, read the basics, read the critical foundational works in the field of culture, and don't waste your time. And unfortunately, Goetz was and is a major cultural icon in the US more, but in France, it's Levi Strauss. In England, it's Mary Douglas. And if you ask all around the world, it's going to be Levi Strauss. So Levi-Strauss is the greatest anthropologist of the 20th century, most likely, I would say. So I'd say read more Levi-Strauss on all kinds of things. Okay, fair enough. I'm being a little bit partisan, but sorry about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone for office hours?